We now adjourn and I call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise today to speak about Aboriginal deaths in custody, and I want to begin with the words of Senator Pat Dodson from the other place. So I ask you sincerely to make this a top priority. For too long, there have been nice words and good intentions, but the lack of action and commitment has not seen a reduction in deaths in custody. It's seen an escalation in the social indicators that diminish First Nations people and diminish us as a nation. Now's the time to stop the rot of First Nations people dying in custody, being over-imprisoned and having their children put into out-of-home care. These are the words of Senator Pat Dodson, and in response to the issue of Aboriginal deaths in custody, Senator Dodson was a member of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which 29 years ago made 339 recommendations to this Parliament to reduce Aboriginal deaths in our jails and remand centres. As he explained in his speech, when the report was published in 1991, 99 Aboriginal people had died in custody. Since publication, a further 437 First Nations people have died. At least 3 of these deaths occurred in the last week. This is a national disgrace. Obviously, in the last week, we have seen thousands of people around the country protesting around these issues. I understand why our citizens, the people we represent here, are angry. I understand why they have decided to march despite the health warnings. And while there obviously are concerns as we're dealing with a pandemic, I want to acknowledge that the people that went to those rallies were aware of those concerns, and such was the critical importance of this issue that they have marched anyway. They should not be dismissed. Their representatives in this place and across the Parliament of this nation have failed them, not just our first Australians, but all Australians who know this isn't right. Of course, I urge protesters to adhere to social distancing measures. The pandemic is still a significant risk to the lives and health of Australians, and we all know that. But if you want to understand why the Prime Minister is hypocritical to tell you not to protest, Google Scott Morrison, "It's a free country," and you'll find what the Prime Minister said about anti-lockdown protests at the height of this pandemic. He certainly didn't call on the police to arrest those protesters. Here in Canberra, a community that cares deeply about social justice, we are represented by Senator Zed Seselja from the Liberal Party. And yesterday, after several TV appearances to condemn the protests, Senator Seselja sent out an email to his subscribers condemning the protests for, quote, undoing all the work done to flatten the curve and stop the spread. Not once did Senator Seselja mention in his email what the protests were about. Not once did Senator Seselja mention that despite making up 3% of the population, 29% of Australia's prison population is Aboriginal. Not once did he mention that the percentage of First Nations peoples in Australian prisons has doubled since 1985, as research by our colleague, the member for Fenner, has found. Not once did he mention that 1 in 5 inmates in Canberra's jail are Aboriginal, and that this had increased significantly since 2014. Nothing Senator Seselja completely erased the protesters and what they were fighting for. Australia has actively erased the histories, cultures and experience of our First Nations peoples. Senator Seselja did this in his email this week, and the Prime Minister did it yesterday when he said there was no slavery in Australia. I am continually inspired by our First Nations leaders in the Labor caucus. I've already mentioned some of Senator Dodson's words. Senator Malarndirri McCarthy's words on the Today Show were so eloquent, bringing mainstream breakfast news attention to the issues. And the member for Barton, Linda Burney, pushing through the hatred to say we need closing the gap targets to reduce incarceration of First Nations peoples, and we need closing the gap targets that reduce removal of First Nations children from their parents at rates that outstrip the stolen generation. First Nations children remain 10 times more likely than other Australian children to be removed from their families, and this needs to change. The start would be to make it a closing the gap target, as Labor have called for. We also need to bring justice targets into the Closing the Gap.
Member's time has concluded, and I